Hey, gang, I'm sorry about that. Dogs were used during the war effort to sniff out landmines, to sniff out spies, believe it or not, um, and for other purposes as well. He did have some unusual weapons. Some of them were effective, some of them were not. Basically, you have this huge gun that was designed to fire a bombard off onto the other side. Here you have basically a mirror to be able to shoot a gun without getting shot. What you're seeing here is Big Bertha. Now, Big Bertha was a gun that the Germans developed that could literally shoot like 80 miles. Yeah, they could hit targets like 80 miles away. The camouflage was unique. Now, sometimes if you wanted to scare off somebody from attacking, if they saw a big gun, they wouldn't attack. So this is actually a dummy gun. It's not a gun at all. It's made of paper. You didn't have the resources to have a big gun yet. So think of poker. This is kind of like a bluff. Okay? You're bluffing. This is a blimp. Yes, blimps were used by the Germans during World War One. These are filled with helium, and here's some more big guns. Look at the size of the bullet. Bombard with that. Yes, horses were used. Horses, especially on the Eastern Front, were used during World War One. Now, this was the Paris gun. It could also shoot a shell 80 miles as well, just like the German Big Bertha could. And these were used to basically bombard villages into submission. Now, propaganda was very big during this war. It was a total war that committed all the country's resources to it. So every citizen was expected to contribute in some way. And you had all these posters like save a loaf a week, help win a war. Save a loaf a week, save a soldier. I mean, you would have that. And you would also have war bonds. Now, this is money invested to pay the country now for the war effort, and the country promised if we win the war, we'll pay you back with interest. This is Lord Kitchener's recruitment poster in Britain. Your country needs you. Of course, when the United States gets involved, they're going to have a very similar thing, except it's going to be Uncle Sam. There's room for you. Enlist today. Women of Britain say go. Yeah, there's another poster that said something where a woman is sitting there and she's saying, I wish I were a man because I'd fight. Real men fight. And that's kind of what they're saying. In Germany, you had posters like this, which basically put a religious emphasis on the war as well. You know, go fight for Germany because Jesus wants you to. You know, as crazy as it sounds, during war, that happens a lot. There's the, gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy. You know, like if you're a real man, you'll go do that. If you don't go sign up for the military, you're not a real man. So why did the United States enter the war? Well, there were several reasons the United States entered the war. So first, it was the sinking of the Lusitania. But if you only put the sinking of the Lusitania, that happened in 1915. The United States does not get involved until 1917. But the sinking of the Lusitania changed our trade patterns. In 1914 and early 1915, we were trading with both with the British and the Germans. After the sinking of the Lusitania, where 126 Americans were killed, American sentiment turned vastly anti-German. So if you look at the chart here, and this is trade by the United States exports to the United Kingdom, England, France, and Germany. And so 1910, 1911, 1912, 1913, 1914, it's pretty steady. Slightly going up in France, slightly going up in Germany, slightly going up with the United Kingdom at the rate of economic growth. Then you get to 1915 with the sinking of the Lusitania, and trade with Germany plummets. And by the middle of 1915, we're not trading with Germany at all. And Lusitania had a big impact on that. Meanwhile, our trade with the United Kingdom and France goes up significantly. We're starting to send them more weapons and more food, and we are supporting their war effort without being in the war. The Germans see this connection, and at first they don't want the United States to get involved in the war, but as the war goes on, they see that they can't defeat the French and the British because they keep having supplies, and the Germans were basically not getting those supplies. So the Germans announced in 1917 a restarting of unrestricted submarine warfare around the British Islands. American civilians were killed again. American sentiment was vastly anti-German by that point, and then the Zimmerman telegram was discovered. It was written by Herr Zimmer to Mexico, stating that if Mexico would get involved in the war after World War I, Mexico could have back its lost lands during the Mexican-American War. This telegraph was intercepted by the British, and then the United States gets involved in World War I, leading to the famous speech by Woodrow Wilson, "We must make the world safe for democracy." The United States instituted a draft and instituted something called selective service. Even to this day, you boys that are in my class, when you turn 18, you have to sign up for selective service. Now, if we ever have a draft, that is also known as conscription, you can be drafted. The United States Armed Forces goes from a measly 200,000 in 1914 to 5 million by 1917 because of that. Herbert Hoover begins his bureaucratic days in the U.S. Food Administration, encouraging people to have victory gardens and those kind of things. Don't waste food. You know, your stories from your grandma of there are starving people in Africa. Those kind of stories probably came from this World War I push of not wasting food. War bonds. Women began to go to work in the factories. Women working at home helped lead to, after World War I, the passage of the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage, or the right to vote. What about the United States? We were neutral, but we favored Great Britain and the Allies. We eventually end up getting pulled into the war by 1917. There was anger in the United States both directions, though. We were upset with the Allies for blocking and mining the North Sea. And we were upset with the Allies of Britain and France blacklisting American countries, and certain Americans were losing money because of that. Meanwhile, we were upset with Germany with unrestricted submarine warfare, and we we used to try to break Great Britain's blockade, but also they attacked our ships. The Germans called their boats Unterseeboots, or undersea boats. They became known during the Great War as U-boats. It would be later that they would be called submarine or under the ocean level boats. That's what submarine means. All right, the Lusitania had 128 Americans, 1,200 dead. At the time, it was reported that it was a civilian ship, but down at the bottom part, they were sneaking in weapons to the British. The Germans warned Americans that ships were liable to destruction, but this angered Americans, and Germany didn't want to bring the United States into World War I, so they promised to stop unrestricted submarine warfare. Eventually, they went back to it, and when that happened in 1917, that's when the United States gets upset. And then the Zimmerman Telegraph, which we mentioned before, will lead the United States into war. By 1917, February, the United States declares war, and they join the side of the Allies with Great Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. Russia will back out of the war with the Russian Revolution, which we'll talk about later. So the big four, the last year of the war, was Great Britain, France, the United States, and Italy. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, and he gets it on April 6, 1917, when the United States Congress officially declares war on Germany. By July 1917, the AEF Doughboys, or American Expeditionary Forces, mobilized and sent to the Western Front. They're affectionately known as the Doughboys in Europe. Meanwhile, in 1917, Russia, which suffered the most casualties and deaths during World War I, the war was very unpopular, and it led to the Russian Revolution. The communists, led by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, led a group known as the Bolsheviks, who were promising property, a return to power to the people, a complete and total withdrawal from World War I, and the killing of all the royals. They promised all of that during the Russian Revolution. The results were that Russia became a Soviet country, a communist country, and the Western Front will be reinforced with troops from the Eastern Front because Russia is no longer putting pressure on Germany on the eastern side. And now the war becomes democracy versus autocracy. Here's Uncle Sam saying, I want you, more propaganda. During the war, censorship was legalized with the Committee of Public Information and the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The Espionage Act made it illegal to interfere with the draft. The Sedition Act made it illegal to criticize the government, president, army, navy, or the war. And it was a $10,000 fine, which in 1917 is a lot of money, and 20 years of jail. It also restricted immigration. By 1918, the war is beginning to unravel in Europe. By May of 1918, the German offensive at Paris is stopped, and the Germans are beginning to desert the army by July. Their resolve is breaking. Meanwhile, through all of that, Woodrow Wilson proposes a 14-point peace plan, which we'll talk about on another day. By September, the Allies began a final offensive and break the German Hindenburg Line. By October, the German army is collapsing, and on November 11th, the Germans sign an armistice and surrender to the army of the Allies. All together in World War I, and yesterday we just looked at one person's story, but all together during World War I, you're looking at 8,500,000 killed in action, another 21 million wounded, over 7 million prisoners, with a totality of 37 million in casualty rate. Look at Russia. Russia will have more killed than any other country, and they don't even get to finish the war. A lot of that had to do with their battle tactics. They would have 76.3 casualties per 1,000 mobilized. That's extremely high. The United States would have a relatively low rate at 8.2. Now, that's still a lot, don't get me wrong, but one of the advantages the United States had is we fought the American Civil War and the Spanish-American War. And in those two wars, we had already fought trench warfare. And then we're coming into the war as the Germans are starting to weaken. So the combination of those two things allowed the United States, in comparison to other countries, to get out relatively unscathed. And so the shift in power begins to happen. The United States, after World War I, is going to be a global superpower. It's still going to be Russia. It's still going to be France. It's still going to be Britain. It's going to be the Soviet Union and the United States on a plane. And Japan. Look, Japan's casualties are very low as well. But that shift in power, that shift is going to begin. And after World War II, the world is going to have two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And these countries that were fighting, that were the superpowers of the world, they're going to be kind of like the second level countries. Before World War I, that's where the United States was. That's where Russia was. It's almost like it flipped by the end of World War II. World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles. The main points of the treaty are basically brat, and that treaty was a brat. Germany was blamed for the war. Germany had to pay war reparations for the war, which led to massive inflation. Germany was forbidden to have submarines, and they could only have an army of 100,000 men, and Germany lost territory. And we're going to see in Alsace and Lorraine, in the Rhineland, in Posen, in West Prussia. Remember, Prussia was one of the countries that got everybody together to form a unified Germany to begin with, and now part of Prussia is gone, and it's given to a new country called Poland. You have the region of Saar taken away. North Schleswig is taken away, and the city of Danzig is taken away from Germany. So all of these areas are areas that Germany lost after World War I. Now, your big four during during the peace talks in Paris at Versailles in 1919 were Woodrow Wilson, George Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, and Vittorio Orlando. Clemenceau will end up going into the talks. It was thought Woodrow Wilson would be the one to get everybody onto a new peace plan for the world after World War I. Unfortunately, it was Clemenceau who dominated the talks. And remember that the French had for years been speaking of la revanche, or the revenge. Well, Woodrow Wilson was seen as too idealist, but he hinged everything on this idea of a League of Nations. So 13 of his 14 points ended up getting taken away for this League of Nations, which is a precursor of the United Nations, which we have today. George Clemenceau had been destroyed in World War I in the Franco-Prussian War, and he wanted to make sure Germany would never do it again. So he feared Germany and wanted to make Germany weak. There was a big discussion with the British as well. Make Germany pay. So David Lloyd George got reelected on that platform and forced the Germans to pay these incredibly high war reparations, which led to huge, huge inflation. And if anybody got jerked around in this whole process, it was Italy. Vittorio Orlando wanted land that was promised and was given Triola and Trieste, but he demanded more. And when others refused, he ended up walking out. So the big four became the big three. And Italy doesn't get much during the war. The results of the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations was created, but the United States, ironically, the brainchild of an American president, the United States won't join because U.S. Congress won't join because the Americans wanted to be isolated from European affairs. Germany lost all its colonies and a lot of its land as well. Their military is limited to 100,000, and they can have no air force and no U-boats. The war reparations was set at $33 billion, and this is 1918, $33 billion. And the Rhineland, which was the border between France and Germany, would be occupied by French troops for 15 years. All right, so that's a lot to take in, and that's why you get 2 days to go over this. You guys have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you next Monday or Tuesday, excuse me.